to keep their territory together because they face breakaway efforts in Xinjiang and Tibet and Taiwan, which they haven't even got control of, and to keep control over what they consider to be national territory in the South China Sea and the Senkakus and stuff like that. So they are not promoting authoritarianism. They don't have an ideological foreign policy. They don't care what kind of a regime North Korea has. It has an authoritarian regime. They don't like that regime. They're not trying to change it. Their security interest is to keep it. They didn't really like the generals in Burma, but they needed good relations with Burma. They sold arms to the generals when the democratic transition started in Burma. I'm not aware of any effort by the Chinese to undermine the democratic transition. They're working with the existing government. They feel confident that Burma depends a lot on China economically, but they don't have an ideological policy. In Africa, they don't have an ideological policy, or in the Middle East.
So what's the basis of the new belligerence? Is this another Malvinas, Ukraine moving?
So when you talk about belligerence, you're probably talking about the South China Sea and then the Senkakus, which are similar pictures, which are, let's put it this way. The South China Sea, number one, it's incredibly valuable. It's really, really, really valuable for strategic reasons, for the sea lanes of communication that China depends upon, the security of those, for the fisheries, which are declining while populations are growing, for the oil. A, it's valuable. B, the Chinese have a claim, a series of claims with different historical bases that are not eliminated by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. That doesn't take away claims that you had 100, 200 years ago. Three, they're facing a multiplicity of other overlapping claims from other people. They actually settled bilaterally with the Vietnamese a maritime boundary in the Gulf of Tonkin, where there was only two sides, the Chinese and the Vietnamese. But the ASEANs are ganging up on, as a negotiating strategy on the Chinese with American support. The Chinese Foreign Ministry doesn't do good. I can do a better job explaining their position on the South China Sea than I don't know why they don't explain it. And
it's sort of like covering the Obama administration.
And all the navies are growing in that region. Not only theirs, and moving around, and the fishing fleet. So when the Chinese say the Vietnamese rammed our ships over 1,000 times, I can't confirm that. I don't have a security clearance, but you know, something like that is happening, the Vietnamese and the Filipinos over the years. And these things have been going on for many, many years. So I think they feel, the Chinese feel that they need to move, they have occupied the power cells already since 1974. That's 30 years that they haven't put an oil rig in there. And I think they came to the place where they're like, okay, it's been 30 years. The other party hasn't settled. We need the oil. But there also is this assertiveness of Xi Jinping. I think he thinks the Japanese are weak, the Americans are weak, we are big. So their foreign minister in one of the ASEAN +3 meetings said that. He said, we're big, you're small. So I think the strategy is we're big, we're here, we're not going away. The Americans will not be here forever. This is a good time to rattle everybody else. But it's not really, what word did you use, aggressive? I mean, it's not belligerent. I don't think they're looking for a war. By the way, if they had a war with the Japanese in the Senkaku, it's not a war, but a kinetic encounter, the Chinese would probably lose. The Japanese are very capable.
So you're saying that any normal democratic country would get impatient eventually and would be behaving the same way?
Did I say that?
Well, it sort of sounded that way to me.
It's a national interest strategy. It's a strongman national interest strategy. I think a democratic system would have the same national interest in maximizing their eventual take of this South China Sea, which sooner or later has to be divided up in some way. But a democratic regime would have a different tenor of relations with other countries, including the United States, would probably be a lot less insecure about being overthrown. We're not going to overthrow a democratic country, but, right? But and the Chinese regime feels itself to be, and all Chinese that I know of feel that the system is in a state of transition. You know, that it has to change. They say themselves, we're building democracy, we're building rule of law, and so forth. So if it were a democratic regime with rule of law, I think it would no longer feel that it was in a state of transition, and it would have a different style with Taiwan, with Tibet, and so forth. And so I don't think it would behave quite in the same way, but I do think it would have the same national interest.
Ruth, you look
troubled.
troubled. So I'm not going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask you why you're troubled.
Furrow brow 1, furrow brow 2.
Right.
Again, I'm not the expert on China that my friend to the left is.
But everybody now speaks about China, even
But I am with the South China Sea. At least I've been looking at it pretty carefully for 6 months. And start with one vignette, which is I won't name the building, but I once went to a building in a prominent Chinese city where I had access to the basement, let's say. And in it, there was a sign saying that the building was part of the Taiwanese Naval Defense Zone. I thought, what? This educational building is part of the Taiwanese Naval Defense Zone and has to have a blast-proof $1 million bomb shelter out of a $7 million construction cost. So there may be a certain residual, I don't know what it is, revanchism or World War II paranoia. But on China in particular, just to start, I think a lot of lawyers would take a different view. China magnanimously signed the Law of the Sea Convention, which means you sign up to its articles, like it or not, whether or not they're customary law. And under the Law of the Sea Convention, this is gritty stuff for a real audience, so just one passing thrust of this. There is no such thing as a historic sea. So China has whipped out of its archives this nice idea, but it's not in the convention they signed, of a historic sea, and they're insisting upon it, and not shy about kinetic encounters, and we are sort of swiveling toward China, toward the region in the South China Sea, but with not much to put on the water, shall we say, a diminished navy. So we're leaving our allies to fend largely for themselves, and I think it's going to give China a feeling of a certain largesse and elbow room, and even the Vietnamese friends of mine who I talk to are quite concerned about this kind of, it's like the Monroe Doctrine China. You know, you're ours fair and square, and you're nominally independent, but you're still in our sphere of influence, and defalcations will be appropriately punished. On Russia, can I just say one thing in regard to David's unhappy narrative, which is unhappy at the moment. I call him Putin in the French. If you don't speak French, too bad. Ask somebody.
Isn't that Montreal French fries with cheese on it?
That's what they are. But I could call it a theory of little Russia, like little England. But I think, is so. Here goes my visa to Moscow, right? But he's so self-pitying in a way about how the Soviet Union has shrunk. Was not Sanforized. And I think a lot of his thrusting really is this sense of, not economics, just Russian grandeur. He's the guy who lost the Russian Empire, so he seems to feel by inheritance. Kind of a brittleness almost. And what makes it so poignant, just becoming an antiquarian for a moment, is that in the late 19th century, the Russian Tsar, if this is our model, was the height of enlightenment. It's the Russians who brought you the legal advisor who convened the 1899 and 1907 Hague Law of War conventions, Friedrich Martens, the first idea of a kind of natural law humanism to regulate the conduct of kinetic wars. Didn't take very well in World War I, but that Russia saw itself very much as an Enlightenment country. My other favorite earlier vignette, American Civil War, 1863, the French and the Brits may recognize the South. This would not be good. for the North or for the abolition of slavery. What happens? This is actually in a Thomas Pynchon novel, too. Thomas Pynchon short story. The Russian fleet visits San Francisco and New York Harbor just to say howdy, howdy to the south. If you're going to blockade attempt any kind of blockade, we in turn can break the blockade. So Russia really has a very powerful liberal tradition sunken at least 100 years ago. And I guess I worry that enough bully boy tactics may almost destroy the memory of that kind of humanism.
Can I jump in? I think in listening to my three colleagues, what does distinguish Putin from authoritarian leaders elsewhere is Russia under Putin aggressively tries to block democracy and respect for human rights in other countries, not just within Russia. Russia, of course, Putin says is off limits, it's interference, something I think we all also hear in the case of China. This is none of your business, we'll take care of our own. Of course, they don't take care of their own, that's part of the problem. But Putin has launched an aggressive campaign to block efforts to promote democracy and freedom and human rights in his neighbors, and arguably, I would say, even well beyond Russia's borders. If you look at the case of Assad in Syria, where I would say you have a like-minded leader that Putin is trying to prop up in any way he can, not just through blocking UN Security Council resolutions, the Chinese do tend to follow that, but arming, aiding, and abetting Assad's slaughter of the Syrian people. This gets at the kind of mindset that I think we're talking about in the case of Putin, which is he does not want to see like-minded leaders fall from power. As he got spooked by 2003 and 2004 with the color revolutions along his borders, he got scared by the Arab movements in 2011, and I think is trying to do everything he can to make sure that what happened there doesn't get repeated.
So you think that's sort of in defense of authoritarianism rather than in defense of the fact that it's the only Middle Eastern ally base, not particularly useful, not one that they particularly used, and a purchaser, major purchaser, particularly after they lost the Libyans, as a major purchaser of arms sales. I mean, to me, I could make sort of a national interest argument for why he's doing it. I think it's crazed and horrifying, but I never really thought of it in the sense, because they don't seem to have the same valence. I mean, as bad as Putin is, he's not slaughtering hundreds of thousands of his people right now.
No, but you think back to how he came to power. It started under Yeltsin with the resumption of the war with Chechnya, but Putin came to power stepping across the bodies of tens of thousands of dead Chechens. So this is not necessarily something alien to his way of thinking. He'll do what it takes to come to power and to stay in power.
This is also Vladimir's desire to have a European presence. He's not stuck in the Black Sea, he's in the Med. He really wants to be a kind of European naval player.
I think both Russia and China look at the world very cynically. They look at the US as an expansionist power, so they consider all of these issues from the point of view of who benefits. Who benefited in Libya? Who would benefit if the North Korean regime fell? Who would benefit if the Assad regime fell? Who benefited from the war in Afghanistan? We don't think of ourselves as having benefited, but strategically, whose strategic position in the world was hugely expanded by the war in Afghanistan and remains enlarged in the aftermath of that war. I think they look at it that way.
So it's sort of, they have a much more zero-sum view of it, and so which is different from necessarily seeing it as a threat to their own. I can see using it as a way to divert attention from their failures versus sort of regional, fear of being surrounded. There are a variety of things going on here. Is Putin doing this in countries, I mean, Belarus does not exactly have a huge democracy movement these days, but has Putin made it worse, or is it's propping up Assad? I'm not sure that's the example that I find all that compelling for that argument.
Well, I mean,
not that I ever disagree with you.
Lukashenko has been a master at playing the West and Russia off of each other, and as someone that when I was in the State Department involved in sanctioning him and his regime, I do give him credit for playing the West rather skillfully, and Putin has played along with that game too. It's well known that Putin and Lukashenko hate each other. but Putin hasn't figured out whom to pick to replace Lukashenko, and perhaps has decided he's also not able to do so. Putin and Yanukovych didn't like each other either. So Putin's abilities to influence changes in leadership in these countries is limited. But at the same time, what he is aggressive about doing is trying to promote efforts by his neighbors in particular to move toward the West. And of course, the whole crisis started because Yanukovych changed his mind about signing these agreements with the EU under tremendous pressure from Putin and also enticement with a $15 billion deal.
Can we talk a little bit about Syria, as horrifying as it is? Just a quick question. I mean, why do you think that Putin is supporting Assad?
They had an election a few days ago, and the result was 99.9. Isn't that democracy?
Well, he did a little bit. He only did slightly better than Sisi did, who got 97%. So.
Certainly, the interest is there. I mean, Syria is a very complicated situation when they have several, starting from the Gulf states to Iran to Hezbollah and many other players in the situation. And we know, like, Russia have a close ties to many of these players, and certainly the effect of their decisions and support to Assad affects the result that we see now and how the opposition and the situation of the opposition outside. And also, I think our reaction or our way how we dealt with the situation in Syria here from the U.S. side was very kind of disappointing to the opposition in Syria. And it seems like we are aligning at the same line with the Russians, but from a different perspective. Sometimes we see it very carefully in terms of how are we going to deal with Syria? Are we supporting the opposition or not? But for a while, we kept debating a lot of things. Meanwhile, there are a lot of lives on the line. The Syrian regime is certainly still have the ultimate power among all of these groups that they are fighting. Part of it, I think, also we are not certain on which group that we should support and which group that. So definitely Russia took advantage of that, and also that they have the history of the close ties that they have with Syria from before, and with Iran and with other groups, make them more powerful in the region. And we see that through across the region. Actually, our publicity as the U.S. is declining. We've seen a different reaction in the beginning when Obama administration took over. And certainly all of these things have changed in the past, I would say, year and a half. In Egypt was, I would say, 5-6 years ago, the reaction was totally different. But now is different towards the U.S. And I think also Russia played on that, and they know how to take advantage of the situation and strengthen their links to the Syrian regime and many other groups in the region, giving their historical challenges that they have or historical differences that they have with the U.S.
It's funny because I sort of feel like the Russians were pretty isolated in the region. I mean, you're describing a Russia that seems to have more influence other than Assad. Ruth,
Well, just I wanted to add on the moral pity of Syria. And yes, we all felt worn out in the 90s by Bosnia. Yes, I think that was another case, dare I say, from a long-time Democratic family, that it was a case of healthcare isolationism, of not wanting to get diverted from a domestic agenda by a foreign distraction. But you haven't seen scenes like that, even in Bosnia, even with Vukovar, of this kind of wholesale destruction. I mean, not since World War II, at least not in the West. And the scandal of, I think, of doing nothing in Syria, not even brushback pitches. Russia likes it because they have a military base. And the son of a bitch Assad stays in power because he's the lesser devil for many, many different groups. But gosh, Willikers, just to allow within our visual ken in the Mediterranean region, a slaughter of 150,000 people. That's, how many Bosnias is that? Several. So I think at least in terms of a metric of American daring do, alongside a decaying military, where we're still probably buying more toys than men, or people, that we're just kind of confessing a dangerous kind of passivity, which our adversaries will take advantage of.
I mean, I am horrified by Syria. I will play the devil's advocate for a moment on this. How much of this is just weariness of Iraq and Afghanistan versus a certain dismay about the excitement that everyone felt for the Arab Spring and the feeling that things just go wrong no matter what, that we can't make things better. Certainly that was, you know, democracy is hard to do, it's very hard to build, you know, everything we touch, that we don't seem to make it better, sometimes we seem to make it worse. I mean, it's not my particular worldview, but you know, you look at what's happened in Egypt, you look at what's happened in Libya, you know, you can see why people would say, how do you even choose sides among the opposition at this point in Syria? I mean, how do you deal with that? And at the same time, the numbers are so horrifying. It's intolerable that that many people have been slaughtered. So I don't know how you know, I do think that part of it is the sense that we can't make anything better.
But query how hard we've tried to lean on Russia, to lean on Syria. We've kind of given Russia a laissez-passer for the whole area. I do think we've become, you know, quite withdrawn, quite solipsistic. And yes, Bosnia was a heartbreak, largely because we intervened too late there. We should have intervened in '93, not '95. But now the roadkill is, again, Bosnia-like proportions. So the fact that we did too little early doesn't seem to me to be a very good reason for doing too little later.
Which is a good transition to the question of, you know, can we make a difference? And we've raised these specific situations. So, you know, when the Obama administration came in, they said we had bigger fish to fry with the Chinese. It was all going to be about, you know, American paper and climate change. And there was more, as the first term went on, more concern about China, including questions about who controlled the seas and how much of this should be negotiated versus done by force. Can you talk a little bit about U.S. policy toward China, both in terms of encouraging domestic reform versus our own self-interest?
U.S. policy has many prongs and, you know, parts to it, and we have a lot of different interests with China. So I think some of the most important work that's done in China is done by the human rights community, you know, outside the government, by foundations. I'm also on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. I really like the work that it does, which is to give, among other things, to give small grants to civil society organizations and to try to build capacity towards some unknown future. The timing, we don't know. The shape of it, we don't know. But one has to, as I forget who said this morning, I mean, one has to support those inside. It depends on the people inside, but and the situation feels very unstable and very transitional, as I said before, so one needs to be in there supporting. And I think that the State Department has made grants and has fought a battle over certain international norms like internet freedom, so that's a role for them. I think that that the State Department continuously intervenes. Now, this doesn't usually pay immediate results, but keeps on bringing up the names of individuals. The Commission on International Religious Freedom, the Congressional Executive Commission on China. The U.S. puts more pressure on, speaking now of the government, which includes the Congress and its commissions and the executive and the different departments of the executive, puts more pressure on China than any other government. It's more than the Europeans do, although they do some as well. And I think that's important, and I think that when the president or you know, goes there, it's one of his agenda items. It can't be the only one. I think that when Hillary made that statement about not letting human rights interfere with bigger issues, that was unfortunate, and it expressed a view that exists in the strategic community, to be sure. But I think overall, on the average, the U.S. Society and government have been pushing in the right direction. We don't see immediate results, but it's the right direction.
Ruth, are we pushing in the right direction on China?
We're providing de facto refugee status. Every time I meet a Chinese student, not here, but around town, shall I say, their parents have sent at least one or two of their kids to get educated here. They're buying property in Potomac, Maryland. They are all hedging their bets. So that, in fact, China, if it was too stupid in regard to its treatment of the nomenclatura, could easily see a very large exit of its educated elite. I worry, we did the Hong Kong report some years ago now in the UN Human Rights Committee. China hasn't itself joined, but Hong Kong, as I now like to put it, 2 countries, 1 system.
Oh, God.
Was under review. That's the turn of the usual phrase. 1 country, 2 systems. At the very end, we were discussing judicial review. Was there such a thing as independent judicial review in Hong Kong? And there still is a sort of lattice work of the old British court system, and sort of staying on Brits who seem very British. But ultimately, it boiled down to the quasi-judicial role of the People's National Congress, in which the Standing Commission of the People's National Congress, which has to have a set quota of members of the Communist Party, has final authority in interpreting any law. So that ultimately, there is no judicial independence in Hong Kong. And you can see it in the faces of some of the old timers. It's like something out of George Orwell. It's just, it feels like the old days, but it's not. And the other thing I've come in contact with, just perchance, was how much wealthy entrepreneurs feel pressured by this. That if they do something that's unpleasant for Sinopec, it's likely as not that they're going to be detained for 2 or 3 years for a kind of administrative detention while vague things are investigated. Very unpleasant. May have to leave the country, abandon their homes and fortunes in China or Hong Kong. So China's not playing like a normal commercial power.
So, Bob Kagan said before, there are places you can change and places you can't change, and no one's going to talk about, I think it was Bob who said that, but getting the Saudi king to abdicate. Are we dealing with China in the right way, given the size of it? I mean, if you talk about the Saudi king, I mean, obviously far more important than even the Saudis. Are we raising enough issues, or should we be pushing them harder, or is this the best that we can hope for, given the fact that they, in part, own us?
I'm not a China hand, so I'm not necessarily authoritative at all, even if I were. I think we still have a sort of almost Kissingerian awe of China. It's the other big power, and therefore it's supposed to be our bedfellow, and our sort of big guys have common problems. And to be sure, they are very powerful, and they have interests in the Arctic too, and we have to worry about the Northern Pacific, and they're our counterweight to Russia, and I think they're probably still quite opaque to us in how they actually operate politically. But I fear me that the opening to China some years ago gave us a kind of naive, sort of Huck-Finish optimism. One last thing to keep in mind, which is an unpleasant topic perhaps, but the opening to China did cost us a very serious human rights situation at the time, which was that the conflict in Bangladesh broke out with the Pakistanis invading Bangladesh as it sought its independence. And we sailed the Fifth Fleet up the Bay of Bengal and prevented the Indians from coming in as early as they might otherwise have intervened to prevent the slaughter. And that was largely due to our attempt to pursue the opening to China. So our accommodation of Chinese interests and our wooing of China has not been entirely cost-free, even for third-party countries.
The moment you've been waiting for.
Russia.
Are we handling, doing anything right in our handling of Putin in Ukraine? Or Putin and his domestic
Well,
repression?
let me preface what I'm about to say of the current policy by saying the Bush administration policy toward Russia, in which I played some role, I was in the State Department for all 8 years in the Bush administration, was not good toward Russia. It was rather ineffective. We did not take, despite what people may claim, a finger-wagging, lecturing, patronizing approach, and those are three adjectives that have been described to describe the Bush, used to describe the Bush administration policy toward Russia. They're just not true. I wish they were true. I wish we were guilty of taking that kind of approach about the crackdown under Putin toward human rights in Russia. We gave Putin a pass for all 8 years, I would say. That said, I think the current administration's policy toward Russia has repeated our mistakes from the Bush administration and possibly made them worse. And the worst part, I would say, is that the Bush administration did pay a lot more attention to Russia's neighbors. And I would argue that the Obama administration has ignored Russia's neighbors for the most part until the crisis in Ukraine exploded. The Magnitsky legislation passed by a huge bipartisan margin in Congress in 2012, I think is a good way to go about dealing with Russia's human rights abuses. It gives definition to the word unacceptable. When we say something's unacceptable, whether it's in Russia or elsewhere, but then we don't do anything about it and we go back to business as usual, it makes us look rather pathetic, I think. So the Magnitsky legislation holding Russians involved in gross human rights abuses, denying them visas and freezing their assets, is a way to hold people accountable.
Can I just interrupt you? When
Yep.
you say it makes us look pathetic, yes, that's one thing, but does it have an impact beyond, I mean, okay, we say we're going to hold people accountable. Does it change anything?
It changes the circumstances for the individual directly involved immediately. It doesn't necessarily change the conditions on the ground right away. I think it will take longer. And I think you have to build up or support bottom-up pressures that I think are there. You think of back in 2011, I think it was, there were protests out in the Far East about the imposition of duties on foreign car imports. And the Kremlin decided to send forces from Moscow rather than rely on the local authorities because they didn't trust the local authorities to put down the protests. There is this sense of insecurity that I think the Kremlin feels. The sanctions connected to Ukraine are different. They're not for gross human rights abuses inside Russia. They're for the violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Those are important, I think, because not only do they target individuals, they target certain entities. I have been arguing for more hard-hitting sanctions for what Russia's done to Ukraine. And I worry that after last week's events and meetings and the competition to get on Putin's schedule while he was in France indicate we're not going to see more sanctions. I think, unfortunately, most Western leaders think with Poroshenko's election victory, the worst is behind us and we don't need to keep pushing. I think that's a huge mistake.
So you expect him to continue to bite off more and more pieces of Eastern Ukraine?
Create instability. I'm not sure he wants much more than than Crimea to take over. Crimea is going to prove costly for him at a time when he can't afford it. All the promises that he's made, it's going to cost several $1 billion. But creating instability, I think, is what he is interested in doing in Ukraine, so that Ukraine and then Moldova, maybe Georgia, become ugly and unappealing for the West, that the West won't want to help integrate them into the Euro-Atlantic community. That, I think, is what he's ultimately after. I think less so than taking over and bearing responsibility for these countries and their populations.
If I could just add one thought also. I forget which administration this would be a friendly criticism of, but we have been very, very reticent in chastising our friends at times when they chastise us, as they should, and we should chastise them. When Chancellor Schroeder joined the Gazprom board, right after leaving office, please.
Or as he was leaving office.
It was not just personally shocking, but he was then in the tank. Mm-hmm. It was a huge Middle Europa signal that Germany would not be offending Russia too badly. And that we should have protested.
You really think that we get, I mean, given the revolving door in Washington, that we get to protest what German chancellors, retired German chancellors do?
Bill Clinton joins the board of Sinopec. How about that? That would be comparable. Or another small example, when I toured the stands in the, when was it? Gosh, the late 90s, I guess. A UN Foundation tour of the stands. And we went to Abkhazia. And there was the pretense that it was a UN peacekeeping mission. But there were landmines all over the roads. So the Russians had Mambas, these V-shaped hull landmine deflecting patrol vehicles, and the UN didn't. So it was the Russians patrolling the roads in Abkhazia. Guess what? They signal where they're going with no particular subtlety, and we're very slow to pick up on that.
Can I just make a quick point, and I'd be interested if Andy has a reaction to this. In 2008, we resumed a human rights dialogue with the Chinese, and even before that, President Bush announced his intention to go to the Beijing Olympics in August of that year. We failed, I would say, to use his decision to go to the Olympics, which I think was a big deal to the Chinese, to extract any kinds of concessions or releases of prisoners and others. And I think that was a missed opportunity. So there aren't often that we have opportunities to push on the Russians or the Chinese to get some concessions, but I think that was one of them. And I don't know what other opportunities may have come along that we haven't taken advantage of.
I think that's fine. I agree, but I think all of that is kind of small ball. Maybe that's a New York City view, and you're in Washington. But because I think it's less and less the case that the Chinese are going to give any quid pro quo. And it's really a strategic, maybe not grand strategy, but strategy
Tactics.
issue that which is to continue to find various ways to signal that at all levels of the U.S. government that number one, it's not just values, it's not just American soft power, that we consider, maybe not democracy is the best word, but rule of law and human rights as strategic interests, that we will always consider it as a strategic interest. And then I think also it's the test of strength. I mean, we've all been talking about it. If they think the U.S. is weak and the world thinks that the U.S. is weak, that's good for authoritarianism. So the success of the pivot, I think, is an important human rights policy as well. You said we're not putting any boats on the water. I don't know if that's really true, and whether our defense budget is as weak as it looks, because it's still by far the biggest in the world, and we have all these allies as well. But Xi Jinping is a strong man personality. He's very confident. And he has a long game, and he's testing the United States through Obama and beyond Obama. He's testing the basic system of the United States, which he perceives as a weak system, systemically weak, economically, socially, culturally. The division of the separation of powers makes us weak. Our stupid electoral system makes us weak, in his opinion. And it's only by being strong, I think, really, that in the end, we would be successful in contributing to not making happen a democratic change in China. But whether we're going to be strong is, none of us knows how that's going to turn out.
I want to move back to the Middle East, but I did want to ask you how one behaves in a, quote, strong way so that the Chinese see it as strong. I mean, they're
very smart. They see everything. So we just have to really be strong, and they'll see
well,
that.
But
The economy has to be strong. The Congress has to function. We have to have a competent administration. We need a good military, which I think we really do have, in fact. And we have to be willing to take casualties if when we draw red lines, they have to be serious and so forth. It's all of those things.
So we have to fix ourselves if we hope to have any influence with the Chinese. It doesn't really matter what we say about what they do. It doesn't matter.
I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I think I did say we have to keep on saying that this is our strategic interest. But who cares what your strategic interest is if you have no strategic clout?
Well, I mean, but the Chinese feel encircled on the one hand by the United States, and at the same time they think we're weak and pathetic?
Yes. I think they feel that we are declining, that we lack resolution, that we are, selfish, opportunistic power. I mean, we do encircle them. They're not paranoid about that. It's a fact. But they believe that we are, that they can push and that we will back off. Now, I don't think their plan is to, as some people say, get the U.S. out of Asia, all the way out of Asia. I think that's not for this leadership cycle. It's not for the foreseeable future. But I think they want to push back against the encirclement and think this is a good time to push back because they see us floundering in a lot of ways and feel that they are, despite all of their problems, on the upgrade, which also seems to be a fact until they collapse.
But if I could just add, that they are wooing and gaining friends by building beautiful ports, the string of pearls, all along the eastern coast. Eastern coast? Western coast. Western. To the west of China. Sri Lanka, for example, included. A beautiful opera house, a beautiful new port. But the one thing I guess I'd keep in mind, my favorite figure of all time, Alexander Hamilton, didn't get to be president, natural born, so they say, but a very smart guy, Washington's brains.
I thought Hamilton was born in Kenya.
Alexander
I'm just
Hamilton?
teasing.
No.
I'm just teasing it.
He could have
Just
well.
kidding.
He's
All right.
actually a Muslim.
Barbados. But Hamilton made the strategic decision that cemented American power, which is to understand that the creditor is dependent on the debtor.
Right.
And by assuming all the revolutionary debts from the states, he prevented any kind of centrifugal force in the U.S. So I think the same thing operates with China, right? We owe them money.
We own them, yes.
They need us.
Inshallah. So, should the U.S. be resuming military aid to the new Egyptian government, sending those helicopters?
Good question. Are they going to stop? I mean, I think we will be, and it will be very interesting to see what is the policy that we are going to use with the new government. Already, there is some kind of exchange in congratulating Sisi on the new election, and I think that's going to happen in the upcoming period of time.
Well, it would probably happen, but is it the right thing to do, given what we've seen this government do already?
I think that's a bigger question. It's the right thing or not. At this point, I don't know, but I think what people see inside there will be the right thing, because to overcome to strengthen the new government in Egypt, and also to give them more power to control the Muslim Brotherhood and also the Hizb al-Nur, for example, that they have.
And that's a good thing?
Well, this is considered, especially what we have seen in the last few months in terms of killing and explosions and this and that. They need to restore order inside the country, and also to bring back the strong military back to Egypt. And this has already been established and being seen by bringing Sisi back.
But it seems like we're making the same mistake we've made for all those years with Egypt.
Well, that's unfortunate, but this is what we are facing right now. And I don't think it's any kind of change is going to be happening anytime soon.
Well, I do think, Egypt matters in two fundamental ways. One is theoretical, which is the ultimate example of making an investment for strategic international reasons and ignoring what happens domestically. And the other one somehow thinking that because we train these people and we give them weapons, that when push comes to shove, we have some influence over them. And yes, there is a compelling argument for why you don't want Egypt to turn completely against Israel. On the other hand, we don't seem to have much influence with them. And when they start outlawing entire political parties and the level of repression that's going on there, I'm personally very uncomfortable with resuming the military aid. I don't know, does anybody else have an opinion on this?
Well, if we are not, there are other people or other countries that they will contribute to that. I mean, we've seen the Gulf states, for example, and their contribution to Egypt in the past period of time.
But isn't that an
it's not
argument
as much
for
as we.
the Gulf states are very dependent on us to protect them.
To a certain
To
extent,
protect
and we are
them. So
depending
shouldn't
on
we
them
be
on-
pressuring them not to be supporting the worst of the impulses inside of Egypt?
We could do that, but we didn't do that so far. And also they have their own interest in Egypt and the politics in Egypt. So we see, for example, Qatar plays different than what Saudi Arabia is doing. And so it's been back and forth. And that's to give the challenge that they have among themselves between the two countries. But at the same time, our position is very important because we're considered the power in the world. But at this point, I think giving back or resuming the military aid to Egypt seems to us as a country here is the solution, and also to resume to normalize the relationship with Egypt and the Egyptians. Seems to be that the way it's going to happen.
So I wanted to throw it open to you guys. Michael.
We got,
No, you don't need a microphone. Everybody else does,
hold on 1
though.
second,
Oh, okay, there it is.
because it's live stream, so we
Oh,
want to catch
that's
it.
right, sorry.
Yep.
Thank you. I'm Michael Mandelbaum from SAIS, and I have two questions. One for David Kramer. If, by whatever chain of circumstances, the Putin regime should crack or disappear, does Russia as a society have the social, economic, and political capacity to install and sustain something that we would recognize as a democratic government? The Ukrainians, after all, had a chance with the Orange Revolution, couldn't take advantage of it. Now they have another chance with what consequences we don't know. How well would Russia be able to do, in your opinion? Second question for Professor Nathan. Is it the case, or to what extent is it the case, that the people in China, who by now I would think are numerous, whom we would regard as natural Democrats, small d, that is, educated, middle class, professional, property people, actually prefer party rule to open political competition to the elements of what we would regard as democracy, because they fear that that would bring either chaos and or populism, which would take away what they have earned?
You want me to start? I do think, Michael, that they have the ability to move in a more liberal democratic direction. I think it's unlikely. I think the next leader to Putin is likely to be as bad, if not worse. So I remember listening to the panel this morning. There was some optimism that it could get better. I certainly don't want to rule out that possibility, but I worry that somebody like Dmitry Rogozin or Sergei Ivanov would come to power after Putin, and I think that would be scarier for us than the current leadership. Putin is, there were surveys done that showed, this was last year and even before, that more than a majority of Russians didn't want Putin to run in 2018 when his term was up. Those numbers may be changing now in light of the Crimea-Ukraine situation. But Putin is, I think, a very good example of somebody who's been around too long. I'm not sure, though, that the system that he has created is going to change all that quickly, and it may, in fact, produce somebody who could be as bad, if not worse, I fear.
So there's a high level of support among the middle class and other sections of the population in China for the regime. It's probably attributable to the economic growth, people being better off every year, most people, and to the fact that, especially for the middle class, a lot of them are economically dependent on the state. You know, their enterprises are controlled by the state. They're, you know, in various ways, they're co-opted by the regime. There's the feeling of nationalism. There's the important factor of repression. I mean, everybody knows that if you step out of line, you're going to get chopped. So that makes people sort of withdraw from political dreaming. But the support, I think, is kind of fragile. And if there's a serious economic setback, or there's always the problem of corruption, which the regime is on the upside of in terms of public relations. But if they're very vulnerable to, you know, these New York Times and Bloomberg stories that exposing corruption at the very top, that kind of thing. As I indicated before, if they did stumble into a kinetic encounter with the Japanese Coast Guard and Navy in the Senkakus, and the Chinese lost, for example, these are all kinds of things that could seriously deflate not just support for the particular government, you know, but for this sort of latent idea that our system basically is rotten. It's working for the time being, but it really needs to change. Now, fear of chaos is definitely a big factor, and fear by the middle class that if we really had one man, one vote, then there are all, you know, there's a majority of peasants and workers who are not the middle class. So people are, I think, very ambivalent about it. It can be handled, I think, best by an orderly democratic transition from the top down, and nobody knows whether. Some people speculate that Xi Jinping is gathering power to himself in order to do a thing like that in his second term. I'm very skeptical about that. But if it happens through a sort of 1989 type conflagration, that'll be very scary, and people are scared of that.
Ruth, just a question, thought on Russia, Mother Russia, as we still call it, if you live in New York. Trotsky used to be on the Lower East Side. My father showed me where Leonard Boudin also showed me where he used to frequent the cafes.
I gotta go.
But if you really did have the shale oil revolution and a natural gas revolution, and if liquid natural gas is as good as some of the SAIS graduates tell me, it's just that LNG compression facilities are expensive to build, so it's going to take a Howard Hunt or a large entrepreneur to put those in place. But if the price of gas and oil goes down significantly, then Putin's in trouble, because he's created this mono-commodity economy. It's not a diversified economy. They used to have old Cold War artifacts of metallurgy and rocketry, but that's not much use in the world anymore. Mm-hmm. So their failure to diversify, I think, is going to make them far more brittle than they might otherwise suppose. And on China, just looking around, I've been fooling around in South China Sea a little bit, and countries that would otherwise be very friendly to China, former communist countries, ones that are still nominally communist, they don't like this know-how. I'll put this in the form of a Yale vignette. At one point, Gaddis Smith, who was a wonderful old diplomatic historian who used to teach at Yale, got in trouble with some students because he'd used the phrase Indochina to refer to peoples who included the Vietnamese. And these two Vietnamese students didn't like being called Indochina. They see themselves as independent. So I do think China can overplay its hands, and even though ASEAN's a fairly weak multilateral organization, if they start picking fights with everybody in the South China Sea or doing serious kinetic things, it's going to cause a major upheaval, and major countries will get involved. Indonesia, Philippines, and they'll lose their natural allies.
Gentleman in the second row here.
Chris.
Chris Walker at the NED. All of the panelists have spoken in one fashion or another of the ways in which the regimes, China perhaps first and foremost, are kind of chipping away at different parts of the international order. The assumption with China 15 years ago was engage, develop mutual dependencies, and wait for modernization to kick in so that we'd all benefit. I think if anything right now, there are big question marks about that. Even if you are worried about the stability of China or if it's reaching a tipping point, as you've written, Andy. What do you see as the main challenges or threats presented? Let's just say for the sake of argument that Russia proves to be durable, China's regime proves to be durable in the way Robert Kagan suggested, maybe much longer than any of us would wish, perhaps, for another decade or so. What do you see as the kind of longer systemic challenges that are presented by this exertion of authoritarian and illiberal influence beyond perhaps China to start with, but beyond borders?
In terms of, you mentioned institutions, are you thinking about that?
Institutionally.
So, yeah, so Ruth should talk about international institutions probably, but it's very, China, you know, has joined all the international institutions, right? They joined the international financial institutions, the UN Human Rights Council, they're of course in the Security Council, the Arms Control and Disarmament. They signed pretty much everything. And they don't sort of openly violate. I mean, World Trade Organization. So we say they violate, they say we violate, everybody goes to the dispute resolution mechanism. It decides, then you drag out your compliance. I mean, I would call that compliance, basically, right? That's what you get in the international system. They file their reports.
Slow burn compliance.
Yeah, right. It's not North Korea pulling out of the regime. So they go, and then they get into all these regimes, and then they say, well, this regime was set up before we were a great power. Now we're a great power, so there should be some changes in the ground rules. Is that compliance, or is that overthrowing the thing? So then there are some regimes that are unclear. The regime of the internet is happening now, and they say we're for internet security, and the US says we're for information freedom and stuff like that. So it's hard to say. So China certainly has an impact. But I wouldn't say that engagement failed, on the other hand, because they did join all these things, and the impact that they're having is in the institutions, you know, more so than outside of them. It's not like back in the day when Sukarno wanted to create an alternative United Nations, for example. The Chinese don't want to do that.
Although Putin wants to do it, but yeah.
The Chinese want to have this United Nations, and they say the U.S. is violating, you know, the United Nations by doing stuff without having it approved by the Security Council. So in some ways, they're more compliant than we are with some of these internet. So I think that, you know, and the international institutions have always changed, right? They're never the same as they were last year. And so China's obviously going to have a role in that going forward.
Could I say a word about a little-known phrase, which I'm going to coin? I call it malign multilateralism. It's not just the good guys who can look to multilateralism. Bad folks can do it too. And that happens at the UN. So just, we tend to think the Cold War's over. It ain't. The same whips are still in place. I can't brand them about 5 years ago now, I guess. A guy named Alfonso Martinez, gray hair, about 17 years old, having perched on the lake in Geneva. He was the guy who whipped through Zionism as racism and every other thing that the Soviet Union wanted. And he was still there. They embed themselves in the institutions, never leave. So my worry is that, and this I didn't realize until I had idle lunchtimes inside the UN in New York. When I was in Human Rights Committee, had nowhere to go, Vienna Cafe, didn't have cigarettes. So what's a girl to do? I want to go to the G77, group of 77, which is actually the group of 132. Climate change session over lunchtime just to see what they're saying. You can't get in. All the regional organizations in the UN, all the caucuses, the G77, which is the G132, are closed meetings until they go to the GA, the General Assembly, to vote. So all the votes are determined off-site. If you're a smart country, You actually do it outside of New York altogether. You have a region, say, again, not everyone will agree, but on the Zionism is racism. They first had a Mexico City meeting, and they have a meeting elsewhere in regional groups. You get the votes committed, then you go to the GA and ram it through. So what people don't look at, I think, and nobody who teaches UN in law schools or political science departments, as far as I know, really has spent much time there as a participant anthropologist to see what the local habits are. But we do not have free reign or influence in the General Assembly. And that in turn leads us oftentimes to be quite impotent when things that are very irritating, to say the least, come through. The one thing the Chinese used to do, that which is interesting, is they were diffident about acknowledging that they were a superpower. So in the Security Council, where they were one of the 5 permanent members and had a veto authority, they would often do what they called Chinese Chapter 7, which is that essentially they would abstain instead of voting no, just to not have any fingerprints, and they found that to be a sufficient estual of responsibility. And lately they've also been picking out paragraphs, ones that they agree to, ones that operative paragraphs, what troops could do on the ground, say if they were peacekeepers, and picking out point by point where they're for and again. So they've become more sophisticated about ways to use the organization.
So there's a price for abstaining, so they influence the drafting of the resolution.
Oh, most of the real business in how resolutions get drafted happens off-site. It's at the British ambassador's house or someplace like that. But the Chinese, I think, have a subtlety in multilateral diplomacy that perhaps they didn't used to have.
The British ambassador's duplex, which is very nice.
Can I just quickly add on Russia, Chris? One of the few organizations Russia has not joined is the OECD, and I hope it won't anytime soon. We in the West have operated on the assumption that bringing Russia into these organizations will be good. They will then learn to abide by these norms and rules and standards, whether it's WTO, OSCE, G7 into 8, which isn't quite a formal organization. And we've discovered that what Russia tries to do is to transform these organizations into what they think serves their interests. And they undermine the human dimension basket in the OSCE. They violate WTO rules soon after joining it. If we've learned nothing else, then I would hope that we would learn not to bring Russia into perhaps one of the last remaining organizations to protect its integrity, because Russia has done tremendous damage to these organizations over the years, and deliberately so. They're not even sophisticated and sly about it. They do it very openly.
So we only have a few minutes. I wanted to just ask you guys all to sum up in just with 1 or 2 sentences. The premise of this conference is that authoritarianism is once again on the rise. And the question that was posed in the invitation was, do we have to do things differently? And I suppose I'm still of the belief that the United States and the democratic countries around the world have the potential to influence. We're certainly wealthy. We may be bankrupt, but we're still wealthy. What is democracy promotion today that makes sense? Is the focus still state to state, or should we just give up and think it's the best thing we can do is go for the 20-year project of capacity building on the ground? Freedom House focuses on both those issues. They rate, they goad governments into speaking out, but you also do it from the ground up. But if we really are in a new crisis of this, maybe we need to make some decisions about where we want to put our resources. So if you could do one thing right now to make things better in Egypt, what would you do? I'm sorry, I'm not picking on you in Egypt. You're not responsible for them, but I want an answer on Egypt.
I think we should change our policy and be more firm and strong about our decisions towards not only Egypt, but the Middle East in general, because they are still, in many countries, looking at us as, I'm not talking about governments, but I'm talking about people looking at us as supporters of democracy and the country that planted democracy in many of these countries. So I think we should look into or revise our revise our foreign policy towards Egypt and other countries in the Middle East, and start acting as more progressive than where we are now.
And specifically, that means what?
That means more and more programs and empowering the people who want that kind of to have the real democracy being implemented.
So you're
in their
talking about
countries.
people to people from
Exactly.
the ground up.
A lot of people been disappointed that we are not really supporting the voices of democracy in their own countries, or been neglecting that in the past few years. So we need to go back to this to be able to get the result that we are wishing for and
Assuming
we hope
that
to see.
they'll even let these groups in, or the people who do the work. Okay, Professor.
I haven't finished reading Kagan's piece in the New Republic, but I liked what he said earlier about grand strategy, Roosevelt's grand strategy. You know, I think it's, and we had a panel, do the internal affairs of other countries matter? I mean, I think we have to renew our commitment to the fact that democracy and human rights are a grand strategic interest of the United States. And then under that heading, this is a multi-arena battle. We've mentioned the various international institutions, and you know, the Human Rights Council, for example, and you know, it's fought in many different places, and so we have to be in all of those places and put effort into it, and including what you described as the 20-year capacity building. I think that part of it is very important too.
If this is urgent, what should we be doing?
If
If we feel that there is a new rise of authoritarianism, what should we be doing differently?
Well, authoritarianism comes in lots of different flavors, though. I mean, there's ideological authoritarianism, there's tribal authoritarianism. So I'm not sure you could cure
Okay.
it with one.
What do you want to do in Syria?
Syria. Let me
You raised it.
Can I choose two other countries first? I'll do Syria.
Yes, okay, but quickly.
So, but just I think we are either very coy or very naive about what really happens in countries. We don't look at all at the influence of France and the Franc zone and how they run West African countries, and how the Praetorian Guard for many unattractive leaders is provided by France. And we even allow the French at times to masquerade behind UN peacekeeping and the ICC in various West African countries. So I think a little bit more of proper name history, contemporary history would help. Ditto my pal Paul Kagame, where it's now absolutely forbidden in American political discourse to re-examine questions like who shot down the airplane, or did Kagame do anything in Eastern Congo? We have all kinds of indexes of prohibition that make the Vatican look like a licentious liberal talk fest. So I guess I would like to have fewer things that can't be talked about. In general, on the whole... Syria. Hey.
In 30 seconds.
In 30 seconds.
25.
Zaid. Okay, my Prince Zaid, who's not a bad guy, is now, from Jordan, is now the new High Commissioner for Human Rights. Me, I try to make something of that. I mean, Jordan's been extraordinarily generous in accommodating more than 100,000 refugees. But if Zaid could get whip up something, given his new both ex officio and personal prestige, he was a plausible candidate for SG, Secretary General, last time around. So I would hope that he could rise to that occasion, given his office and his place. You've got to get rid of Assad. I know he's the devil that we know. I know he's the placeholder for Assyrian Christians and people who feel uncomfortable with an Islamist regime. But he now has so much blood on his hands, he cannot remain in power in the long term. It would be shameful if he did.
In the part of the world that I've focused on, I would say, if you look at U.S. and European policy, March 1 of this year to where it is now toward Russia, there's been a sea change. And I do want to acknowledge that. But it's been too reactive, and it hasn't been enough. We have to understand that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I would argue, poses the gravest threat to freedom as well as to the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, the first annexation of a European state by another since World War II. And it is an enormous threat that we need to rise to the challenge to meet. I do think that it has ramifications beyond the region. Our allies are looking at us to see how we respond, and it will have an impact on how much they rely on us and trust us. Our adversaries, our enemies, are watching how we respond, because then they might no longer fear us. So I think the response, and it has to be sustained, and it has to be accelerated and deepened toward what Russia's done to Ukraine, is going to have a huge bearing on where we go from here.
So meals ready to eat doesn't do it for you?
Falls quite short.
So, David, are we talking about military training and support for the
I would
Ukrainians? Or are we
argue-
talking about sectoral sanctions, or all of the above?
All of the above. I would say sectoral sanctions, I would say military assistance. That does not mean U.S. troops on the ground, but it does mean providing anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles to the Ukrainians so that they can defend themselves. They want to defend themselves. They don't have the means by which to do it. And yes, MREs and these things fall well short. It is time, I think, to move from non-lethal assistance to lethal assistance. I say that with some hesitation, but we're trying to help a country defend itself against what I would say is the biggest threat we've seen in many, many years.
I wanted to thank, I apologize, I wanted to thank everybody, you guys. It was very useful for me. I've got all sorts of ideas to write about. So thank you all. I think there's a coffee break and then back to it.